So we're thinking about the cost from the production cost from a firm's point of view. We talked about the difference between explicit and implicit cost. Now we want to think about, just for a second, economic time. Because economic time is determined not by the number of days or weeks or months, but determined by a cost structure, in fact. The short run is the period of time in which some input or some cost that the firm faces is fixed. A lot of times these are fixed by contracts, perhaps. A firm might lease a building for 12 months. And if all their other costs can vary, then the short run for that firm would be 12 months, the duration of the lease contract. And the long run is the period of time in which all production costs are variable. So all costs can vary. That means all production inputs can vary in the long run. Again, these are largely determined by contracts. We'll talk a little bit later on about the short run versus long run decision making process. The production function is determined by production technology. It describes how inputs are mixed to produce an output. So we write down a production function, kind of an equation that says how we mix things like capital and labor in order to produce a certain amount of output. And so what we're going to think about first is imagining that we have a fixed plant size to which we can add a variable input. In this case, we're going to add labor to a fixed amount of land and capital. So we're holding land and capital constant, we're adding labor to it, and thinking about how the level of output changes. That change in the level of output is called the marginal product. So we'll be thinking specifically in our example about the marginal product of labor. So the marginal product of labor will be the change in output that we get from employing one additional unit of labor. We're going to see how the law of diminishing marginal product, that is, adding more and more of a variable input like labor to a fixed plant, results in smaller and smaller increases in total product. We call that diminishing returns or diminishing marginal product. Diminishing marginal product is what's going to lead to that upward sloping supply curve that we saw earlier. Let's look at the example here. Here we have a production function that shows the relationship between the amount of labor employed at a vineyard here, in this case. Let's watch the table there in the left panel, where it says if we employ 0 workers, then we have $0 worth of output. That's pretty straightforward. If we have no people working, we have no output, and no output. This is measured in dollars worth of grapes per day. So if we go from having 0 workers and employ 1 worker, we'll see that the total output increases from 0 to 10 units. That means the marginal product of the first worker, the increase in total output there, is 10 units. So we add a worker, we get an increase of output of 10 units. We add the second worker, and what we see is that the total output goes from 0 to 22, which is an increase in output of 12 units. So the marginal product of the second worker is 12 units. Perhaps they are able to work together somewhat to be able to increase their output, because you see doubling the workforce from 1 to 2 actually more than doubles the amount of total output, right? Output goes from 10 to 22 in this case. By the way, we are implicitly assuming here that all these workers are exactly alike. Now when we add the third worker, there's an increase in output, but the increase in output is a bit smaller. We go from 22 to 33, which is a change. Our marginal product of the third worker is 11 units. As we increase our workforce to 4 workers, we get an increase to 42, or we say the marginal product of the fourth worker is 9 units. We add the fifth worker, we get the marginal product of the fifth worker is 6 units, and the sixth worker increases output by only 2 units. So what we see here is the law of diminishing returns to labor at work, and we can think about why this might be true, right? We have the people who are picking grapes in this case, and if they're picking grapes, we can imagine that one worker has to pick all the grapes from one vine and then move on. We can imagine some sort of teamwork process that allows a little bit of specialization in this process. Maybe one worker gets the high grapes and one worker gets the low grapes or something like that, so that they are a little bit more specialized, or they take turns carrying the bushels back to the barn, or back to where the grapes are being gathered, so that when they can specialize a little bit, they can increase their output. Like when we see the number of workers go from 1 to 2, output more than doubles, and in fact, the third worker's marginal product is bigger than the first worker, so they are increasing the kind of average output per worker in this case. And then the productivity begins to fall, because it's hard to increase output per worker when there's no more specialization involved. And we can think about other kinds of production where this would be more pronounced than maybe picking grapes. There is the famous story about specialization in the gun production business. It was at one point in time that a gunsmith would put together the locking mechanism, would craft the stock of the gun from a piece of wood, and also form the barrel and then put it all together. When these jobs are divided up, and one specializes in lock, one specializes in stock, and one specializes in barrel making, and then maybe even the fourth one assembles, the output of the 4 workers, each doing an individual specialized job, greatly exceeds what the 4 workers could have done individually. Now, beyond that level of specialization, we can expect diminishing returns to set in. But as we think about these production costs, that we differentiated already between explicit and implicit costs. We want to also differentiate, because we already mentioned fixed and variable costs when we mentioned economic time, so that that total cost is the sum of both fixed and variable costs, and that fixed costs are those that don't change with the level of output. You have fixed costs at your house probably, where you pay a set amount of rent each month, and the amount of time that you spend in your house does not change the amount of rent you pay. Whereas your utility bill, your electricity bill is going to change with usage, so it depends on how much you use it. Likewise, a firm may have fixed costs. That maybe a restaurant might lease a building for a particular amount of time, where its fixed cost would be the cost of the rent on the building, and then its variable cost would be its food and labor costs. So we can see how those can change and vary directly with the level of output. These short-run cost curves the average total cost, average fixed cost, and average variable cost. There's good illustrations of them here. We won't write down the definition on that page. We'll take a look at this one. See that the total cost is the sum of fixed and variable cost. The marginal cost, the change in total cost that we get from producing an additional amount of output, always has this nice shape that looks like a check mark. The average fixed cost is going to be always declining, because if you look at the average fixed cost there, it's total fixed cost divided by quantity. These fixed costs don't change, so as the quantity gets bigger, as the denominator increases, this whole fraction is going to get smaller. So we see as we go from left to the right, this number, average fixed cost, is going to get much smaller. Total average variable cost is total variable cost divided by quantity, and it's going to have this U shape as well. And so because the average variable cost has this U shape, average total cost is going to have a U shape as well. And so we'll look at the relationship between these later on when we talk about the firms more specifically. The long run average cost curve that we saw, the short run average cost curve or average total cost, is kind of U-shaped. This is kind of U-shaped too, and it's going to depend on the industry, but there are going to be some industries where we can imagine the minimum average cost is going to be reached at a very small quantity, and this is what economists call economies of scale. That is where increasing the level of output can actually increasing the level of output can actually decrease the firm's average cost of production. So in some industries it might be true that having a few big firms leads to lower average production costs, which means lower prices for the consumers usually too, and this is what's called economies of scale. The other end of that is what's called diseconomies of scale, and that's where beyond a certain level of output, increasing output raises the per unit cost. This is because of that diminishing marginal product of inputs. Go ahead and finish up your homework for Chapter 6, and we'll talk to you soon in Chapter 7. Thank you.